Sanjeevan Bala, welcome to the Data Strategy Show. It's great to have you, Sanjeevan. It's great to have you on the show. So look, thanks for coming along. Would you sort of, open up and just give us a bit about who you are and what you do and a bit about your background, and that would be great.
Absolutely, Samir. It's great to be on. So I'm Sanjeevan. I'm the Group Chief Data and AI Officer at ITV. Effectively, my role is helping the organization sort of realize value from data and AI. So that's both across our studios business that produces and distributes content globally, including sort of companies like Netflix, Apple, and Amazon, but also ITV, which is probably more familiar to the UK audience, which is the TV channel, and ITVX, which obviously is our direct consumer ad funded proposition with also a subscription media sort of element to it as well. So my background, it's been quite varied actually. I thought it started off in sort of management and strategy consulting, and I think as you start those roles, you get a really big breadth of working in different organizations, different cultures, different sectors. Then moved into sort of startups and scale-ups in Silicon Valley around the first .com sort of bubble. So that was sort of hyper growth and a lot of those kind of ideas, sort of delusional optimism over these business models.
I like that, delusional optimism.
Then moved into sort of client side roles. So companies like dunnhumby, which is quite pivotal, around what dunnhumby did with Tesco Club Card, and then more recently into sort of media and entertainment roles. And then the latter stage, I've also secured a non-exec director role on a FTSE 250 as well. So it sort of brings a nice balance to sort of a career trajectory, I think.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. That really is quite a diverse sort of background you've got. But listen, so your job title has data and AI in it. It's so clear that obviously data and AI are now the two biggest things that have got this street credibility. But going back to your career, can you sort of share a moment or experience in your career that significantly shaped your perspective on data, and how it's influenced you and your approach as a leader today?
Yeah, I'll call on 2 points in my career. That's right, Samir. So I think the first was much more around, I think, sort of leadership competency and sort of how you think about what it means to lead teams. And it was way back when I was in consulting, and effectively what happened is, there was an existing project with an existing client, and it wasn't going particularly well.
Right.
A lot of issues with the client, a lot of issues with the sort of delivery side of the team. And we were jettisoned in as sort of on the consulting side, but part of the new leadership team to sort of turn around that particular project. And I think what was really interesting there is it's one of those things that you often hear in that, the team you have is the team you get to work with, right? It's not like you get to sort of pick a new team and that sort of thing. So that old mileage very much held true. And I think what was really interesting in that project is once you invested time and sort of created this sense of self-belief, and a really strong, compelling kind of narrative around why are we here? What is it we're trying to achieve? Which goes far beyond sort of just delivery for what the client wants, right? So you sort of tap into this higher belief and a higher narrative and a deeper story around why we're here.
Sure.
And then I think as we spent a lot of time on that and what it meant for the individual consultant on that particular project, everyone started to get a real sense of like ownership. And it started to galvanize this feeling around a higher purpose, what they're here to deliver, why we were doing this particular project with a client. And what you could then see once you got that personal connection with the team, you then could absolutely turn it around, and they could then start to sort of, believe in sort of delivery and excellence in delivery and those things. And I think that motivation, how you tap into some of those sort of personal elements of teams and individuals, was absolutely something quite critical and quite stark when you saw the sort of the before and after, because it was really the same team that we had, right? We didn't get to change the team over, as it were. So that was one element that really shaped how do you think about tapping into sort of the personal psychology of an individual that sits within the team, and how do you connect that personal narrative to a higher purpose around why we're here and what we're trying to achieve. So that was one element of it. I think the second big part that definitely shaped the way I tend to think now is when I had a period in sort of startups and scale-ups in Silicon Valley. And I think what was interesting about my time there is you'd often develop plans around going from, let's say, 1 market to 10 markets, right? And what you were often challenged to think about is, well, what if you did instead of going from 1 to 10, what if you went from 1 to 10,000?
Okay.
What problems are you then going to try and solve, right?
Right.
So to put it in other terms, if you had a 3-year plan for a business strategy, what happens if you deliver that in 3 months
Mm-hmm.
versus 3 years?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what that does is it causes you to think about the problem statement in radically different ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so some of the themes that you start to think about is, the fact that there's rapid commoditization happening in the market generally. The fact that if you solve a particular problem, how much scalable is that particular
Mm-hmm.
problem you've solved? And are
Mm-hmm.
you solving that problem at a very scalable outset, or you're solving the problem you've got it ahead of you? And what that then got me thinking around is what I describe as the Lego strategy of modularity. So when you think about these problem statements, it's really critical to break them down to component parts and then solve for those component parts in a very modular, Lego-like,
Mm-hmm.
brick-like way,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
that allows you to scale. And I think that scalability mindset definitely has continued on with me. So I tend to be sort of more you've got to be buying and
Yep.
partnering because you can get there faster
Yep.
than necessarily always building. But I think that's definitely another element
That's
that's definitely
interesting.
shaped my thinking around how do
Yeah.
you really think about hyper scaling? Because it's a very different problem statement you're solving for.
It is, and what I like about those two elements actually is one has got the purpose piece, but the other one, when you talk about hyperscaling, to me it sounds, how do we go big, but with the thinking that we're really, um, we know that it may not happen, but how do we link that purpose of what we're doing to that go big, those values or that vision, and then really sort of push ourselves to get there. And I think maybe that was what you called the delusional optimism earlier on. Because then I get that in the back of my mind thinking, okay, well, a lot of people had that thinking back in the, in the early internet, .com sort of era. And so on a hyperscale and then that delusional optimism with that purpose, that's a pretty powerful triangle, in the way that you've sort of put it.
Yes, I think what's really interesting is I think it helps to really galvanize people
Mm,
and teams,
mm,
right? And it's about the stories you can create, the sort of
yeah,
the future worlds and visions and scenarios you can kind of reimagine. And I think it gets quite compelling, and I think it gets people into a growth mindset of where they're
yes,
going versus a slightly, dare I say, a defensive BAU
sure,
sort of,
sure,
running of an operation that's sort of being managed from
yeah,
a cost perspective. And I think
yeah.
that mindset, I think, gets you into a much more different growth mindset, which is psychologically a very different place to be.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And you mentioned value at the beginning, and I think that's where a lot of teams are possibly um, lacking in terms of that focus on value, more being the cost center and being defensive or governance led. And I think that's the bit which is really key for anybody in the industry. Just getting on to sort of the value piece. How have you taken what your learnings have been over that period of couple of decades or more, um, into a very um, interesting, media company. We all know what ITV is. We've been born up with ITV as one of the main channels on TV. At least, I'm old enough to remember that when there was probably only about four TV channels, or maybe six TV channels. Maybe I'm not that old, but how do you make the shift from that sort of it, because they have to be innovative. you know, ITV has to be of the moment. It has to understand what is the feeling that people have. How have you contextualized and used data and and AI in that view to really think about your data strategy and how that works in what I would say is quite a fast-paced changing industry, because the Netflixes and the Amazons and the on-demand channels have completely radically changed the whole world in the way that we consume media. So it's just, as you started to talk about that, how have you started to, I know you've been in that sort of industry where, in the .com and internet, you had to move quick, but I feel like this is even quicker. Maybe I might be
Yeah,
wrong.
no, it's really interesting, Samir. I think my observation of very creatively driven organizations
Mm,
like ITV is it's part of the core of the DNA of the organization. So if you think about the rate at which content is created, there's a
yeah.
lot of ideation, the
Yes.
narrative arc. It's a deeply creative process,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And then what's really fascinating in sort of media organizations is they're very used to sort of experimenting creatively with a
Yeah.
format, right? Putting it out there, and having an audience sort of, react and respond to it, as well
Mm.
as
Mm.
advertisers that are obviously going to, sort of advertise around the content.
Sure.
And, they're very adept at sort of taking that feedback, learning from it, and then taking that round again and say, okay, well, what are we now going to commission next? What are we going to
Mm.
look at next year? What's next year of roster going to look like? So weirdly, what I've observed is in our DNA, we're very used to the sort of like creative endeavor, that
Right.
culture of experimentation,
Yeah. Yeah.
sort of, putting some investment money behind a particular concept, in a particular show that we might back, and
Mm.
sort of putting it out there. And because that exists as part of, who we are, so we describe ourselves as an integrated publisher broadcaster, um, that permeates the rest of the organization.
Right. Right.
So what we did was, when we started the strategy here, is we spent a lot of time with the business describing kind of the art of the possible,
Mm. Mm.
understanding, so that the business had an awareness of what could be done.
Yes.
And once you'd done that, and because we embedded teams into the business units, because we believed it was much better to be embedded and decentralized rather than an ivory tower,
Yeah. Sure.
um, it meant that, teams would go native. It
Mm.
also meant that the quality of the ideas was much stronger because it came
Yeah.
from within the
Yeah.
business context,
Yeah.
with business leaders that were grappling with, how do they make, content more commercially viable, or, how do we kind of exploit it from a marketing perspective? So all the levers in the organization in terms of,
Mm.
how do we promote our shows? How do we get them to watch more content on ITVX, through to how might we monetize the advertising around that, would come up with some incredible ideas because it was much more closely aligned to the business.
Right. Right.
And that then creates the pull. So I think you go from a
Yeah.
sort of a soft push
Yeah.
to a
Yeah. Yeah.
business pull. I think if you can
Yeah.
get that right, the rest of the strategy looks after itself.
And I think that's interesting for a company, for any kind of, for a media company, because you are so hot on customer insight and content generation. You really need to match those two to make sure that you're getting the viewership and people are reading, or from a publishing perspective, understanding what's happening, the narrative, etc. So how do you start to, um, as a media company, and you talked about it previously, this content generation, how do you, with the way that data and AI, not data more, AI more so, changing so rapidly and quickly, what are the emerging trends that you sort of find most exciting and impactful for your business? And in in the way that you have to now probably, I don't know actually whether you have to pivot quickly, with things like Gen AI, and, how do we start to think more differently about content generation and, using these types of tools? What are the ways that you have embraced it, or at least led that sort of vision?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think I describe the phase we're in at the moment is in the sort of the teenage consumerism phase of the hype cycle, right?
I thought you were going to
Um,
go to that famous phase of, when big data was around, everybody said
uh,
everyone's talking about it. It's a bit like teenage sex. Everyone's
oh
thinking
no, no,
about it.
no.
Everyone's talking about it. No one's doing it.
I
That's
think, I
where
think
I
this one's
thought you were
slightly
going.
different. No, no, no. I think this one's a bit different. So some of the
Yeah,
macro themes I see
yeah.
here is, look, a lot of what you're seeing at the moment in these large language models is what I describe as an inch deep and a mile wide,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So these things are all right at lots of things, but not great at any one thing
Mm,
necessarily. And I think what is increasingly happening, I think, is companies are realizing that actually the intelligence that is contained within the company, in the data, in the
mm,
video assets, in content, in emails, and all the rest of it, is an inch wide and a mile deep.
yeah, yeah.
And it's that depth that's really important to understand. In that, for all the hype around the large language models, actually, I think the real interesting aspect of this is what you describe as a small language model,
Mm,
or retrieval augmented generation, which allows you
yeah.
to kind of combine your foundation model with deeper organizational context.
Right,
Then these things
right.
become more useful. So that's one trend that I think that we're seeing, in that, okay,
Hmm.
it's not necessarily about bigger models, more data.
Yeah.
And I think the market at the moment is very much fixed on moving the data to the model,
Yes.
which means you need bigger processes, bigger foundation models, bigger
Hmm.
processing, bigger, call centers in your distribute compute clusters and
Hmm.
all the rest of it.
Hmm.
So that's one mega trend. The second one, I think, is this whole thing around this rate at which commoditization is happening of these tools, right? And what I would describe as the enterprise grade version of these tools aren't there yet, right?
No,
so what we're sort of doing, so that's the second, and then I think the third strand is this sort of what I describe as a multi-agent approach, as in where I think this could all come together quite elegantly is you'll have your sort of like your foundation model running at the very top, but that will be able to call upon very domain specific small language models, right? That might have very deep domain expertise in marketing, or deep domain expertise in our commercial organization, or deep domain expertise in our product organization. And because that nuance, that business understanding is deeply entrenched in the business organization itself, if you can tap into that, the foundation model, you can get this multi-agent model working quite effectively.
Sure.
So I think where that leads us to is, what I think we've been doing is getting our organization kind of what I describe as AI ready, right? So that's around very much, I think for a lot of the hype, at the end of the day, this is going to be a people transformation. It's not going to be a tech transformation. It's not going to be even a data transformation. It's going to be a people transformation. So we spent a lot of time on what we call educating colleagues around the organization around what is Gen AI, what's the art of the possible, how can it be used? And I think what was really interesting when we did that, Samir, is I think colleagues, when they saw it live, could suddenly connect with it and say, I see how this could play a role. I see how this could be useful. I see how this could create productivity benefits for us. The other interesting learn was that equally we could see where it wasn't quite ready yet. And I think the word yet is critical here, because I think we all realized this is the worst it's ever going to be. It's only going to get better at the rate at which it's improving. So I think that's the other big trend there. The bit that has been really interesting for us, though, is our reality is we have quite well-established horizontal workflows in our organization, right? So ITV, we produce, promote, distribute, and monetize content is effectively our value chain. And that horizontal workflow has been optimized, developed over years, right? So it's a very efficient workflow effectively to get content in and then getting it kind of broadcast and monetized. Now, a lot of these generative AI tools, they're solving vertical problems at the moment, right? So you've got a tool that does language translation, another tool that does this, another tool that does that. It could be Runway ML or one of the other tools. And so the challenge you have in enterprise organizations is you have to keep putting things in and out of your workflow. And when you keep putting things in and out of your workflow to put them into these consumer grade generative tools, you're losing a lot of productivity.
Right.
So I think where the market's probably going to go now is, do you wait for like an Adobe that already has an interface into the creative organization? And do they add on capabilities and grow horizontally? Do you know what I mean? Because the interface into the organization is going to be really key. Because if you just give, let's say a script writer a ChatGPT interface, it's probably not going to be that great. Whereas if you give them a creative interface that they're already used to using.
But they've got the tools around them.
And they're already familiar with the tool set. The adoption rate, the onboarding is going to be a lot smoother. So I think the market hasn't quite corrected for some of those things yet. So I think one is the enterprise grade. Second is the interface, the UI UX that's going to be compelling for a business user to onboard in a very easy to use manner. I think is going to be critical as well. And I think those things are still emerging in the market.
And I think you're right about that. One of the things that actually you mentioned a little in your previous response was about these localized GPTs. I mean, let's just call them localized agents. I actually think that increasingly is probably the way that many organizations are going to go, because it would make sense for me if I was a script writer or if I was a producer or an editor or whatever, that I had one of these working while I wasn't there. I mean, it's a weird thing, but it's almost, I think of it on the level of if I'm the CEO and I'm running a company, and while I'm sleeping, I want my CEO GPT to be knowing what's going on everywhere. If I've got a multinational company, whatever it might be, but I want to know what's happening in the operations. I want that GPT to speak to, maybe it's not going to be GPT or whatever, I don't know, speak to the COO GPT, speak to the CFO GPT. And then suddenly when I'm in the morning, I've got a real understanding of, what's happening. And I think that's the game changer for me, because we've been so focused on, let's just call them data products or dashboards, right? Which can be static in nature. People come in and look at them and go, "Oh God, I can't be bothered to use this," And most companies they look at them and actually when they review how many people have used them, it's quite low in terms of the sort of onboarding. So when you said it's interesting to see your education process of how people were able to latch onto it very quickly. That's the beauty of what's happening with AI right now.
Yeah.
Because
I think
anybody can more or less pick it up without even thinking about it. It's like second nature because it's natural language, So sorry, you're going to say something.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, for a while the market was sort of, there's a lot of hype around needing, prompt engineering as a skill set, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at what's happening when you use something like Midjourney versus DALL-E, there's now another abstraction layer where if you go into DALL-E, you put in a very simple prompt, it converts it to a very complex prompt, and then it generates your image, right?
Yes.
So the need to, refine tune your prompt is less material.
So. Yeah,
Right.
You're right.
And don't get me wrong, in Midjourney, if you're a creative, photographer or a designer, you can create really detailed prompts, right? Because you know exactly the style, the length, the shoot, the type of lens to use, the style of lighting, the effects you're after, and you have that deeply embedded knowledge as a creative leader, right? So you can direct the tool in a much more nuanced way. So I think that's what's happening. There's this sort of accessibility that's going to be improved over time. That makes it much more accessible to a lot of consumers and professionals in the organization. I think where we're going down is this sort of much more of a co-pilot productivity enhancement than an autopilot.
Than an autopilot. I agree, and I think that's I got access to Microsoft Designer the other day, and I literally within 2 minutes had created pictures that I wouldn't think that I would be able to create. And my daughter was standing next to me. She said, "Daddy, did you just do that?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Wow." And so she started doing it. And within a couple of minutes, she equally had a couple of pictures. Okay, she put some silly things in, but she was probably testing it. And then she started to get a little bit more serious. But I could just see her brain sort of, going through these moments of clarity and consuming this, just experience was crazy. And I don't think that's ever we've ever had that with anything like a dashboard or any other data product ever. So I think the evolution is definitely kicked off, but I think there's going to be there's a lot to take in with the introduction of this style of new ways of working. As somebody who's on the forefront at a media company who's on the forefront of things anyway, how do you strike the balance between thinking about innovation, but then on the flip side, you've got an audience, you've got customers. Then how do you, sort of think about being responsible and ethical, about these new tools and data and so on moving forward? Just balancing that between innovation and ethical use.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things certainly for us, we felt very strongly about is you have to bake a lot of those things at the outset. It's really difficult to do it sort of after the fact because you're constantly chasing your tail. So when we got going, certainly on the data strategy, we had a whole number of set of principles, which was around privacy by design, security by design, sort of, and we have a separate ethical committee as well. So we're very much joined at the hip with those sort of other leaders in the organization, because if you don't set those principles up by design at the outset, it's very difficult later on because you're constantly chasing your tail. So I think that's how we certainly approached some of those statements. And I think the thing with ethics that gets really interesting is it has to also align with your sort of organizational purpose and meaning. And then you get into sort of really interesting questions around, well, what aspects of these are you trying to sort of manage? Is it sort of the data that's going in, how the model is being operated, or how it's being used? And the same thing's happening in the regulatory environment, right? What aspect are we trying to regulate here?
Yes.
And I think you need to take that sort of framework and apply it to, your own thinking. And there's some other interesting things, right? So for example, where you may be using some of this for ideation that never makes it to, finish, finalize production assets. Well, what level do you need to kind of govern that on versus something that might be used all the way through and it ends up as something that we might use sort of more creatively? And I think depending on that sort of application and use case, there's different levels by which you need to kind of assess these things, because you get into very quickly things around how do you think about protecting copyright and intellectual property? How do you ensure that there's no misrepresentation of those things? How do viewers feel about some of these things? There's a lot more issues and challenges you need to kind of sort of think through as you're designing these things before it sort of finally becomes a finished output. And I think that considered approach definitely seems to be the one that means you're taking a more measured approach in some of the generative opportunities that are emerging on the horizon.
Yeah, I almost feel like as you're talking and as I'm thinking about it, it sounds like you have to spend a lot of time with legal.
I mean, the way, because we set it up sort of with this by design principle.
Yeah.
What we found is it's a lot better if they're all involved at the very outset.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Because what can be really powerful with our legal colleagues is they're able to then shape and help co-direct some of the considerations as you're doing the development.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's always about 100 times worse if you develop something and then you have the afterthought. Like it just never does well. So I think we baked it in right at the outset, and we're very much joined at the hip, which I think it helps tremendously in terms of pace, innovation, cadence, because you can just run a lot faster because you're collectively assessing and addressing kind of the opportunity right at the outset, which I think is absolutely critical.
And what would you say are your biggest use cases using some of, I mean, I know you don't have to give away anything commercially, but what would you say are the things that have really been taken on quicker and people are sort of using it in a way to maybe build scripts or to design new shows, or has that happened, in a really deep way yet?
Yeah, so I think I'll describe the three big areas of our business. So for three of our big sort of KPIs, if you will, are around double the monthly active users. So that this is sort of, how does marketing effectively become more efficient in acquiring viewers onto ITVX? Double the number of viewing hours and doubling of the digital commercial revenue, so advertising revenue on ITVX effectively. So what that then means is it's being deployed in marketing. So marketing can, at the moment, for example, optimize and tailor the way in which we're promoting some of our shows that are coming up this week, next week, the week after on ITVX. And critically, marketing are able to tailor those and target those viewers and consumers on Snapchat, Instagram, on social media
multi-channel
platforms.
Medias.
Absolutely multi-channel. So they can do the targeting much more cost effectively, and they can tailor and personalize the targeting to a level they couldn't before. So that's the first. That allows them to sort of bring audiences in and make them aware of the content. The second then within ITVX is personalization, which is now being rolled out. And that's much more around, well, once you come in and you watch the show you've come in to watch, what's the next thing we should recommend to you? And there's loads of things here, Samir, around, well, do we think about content breadth? So if you came in for an entertainment format, do we recommend a different genre? Or do we go down a depth strategy, which means you've come in for entertainment, well, let's recommend another entertainment show, for example.
Right.
And depending on what sort of segment you are, where you are on your journey with us, how familiar you are with ITVX, there's no one rule to fit them all, if that makes sense. So there's different variations, different trees and different paths we might go down. And what the recommendation service allows us to do in the organization is create a lot of those sort of different pathways and test a lot of those pathways. That's using that information to kind of increase the number of viewing hours. Then the last phase is the commercial piece, which is around tailored advertising and contextual advertising, and that's where the teams have got an AI agent that watches the content, listens to the audio file, and reads the subtitles, and effectively allows them to contextually place an ad that's contextually relevant to the content. So an example might be, let's say coffee is spoken about very, very positively in the first sort of part of a show. We can then place a coffee ad in the first ad break. And because it's spoken very positively, the contextual sort of brand recall metrics are really, really high. And so those are examples where we're starting to deploy this capability across our marketing, product, and commercial teams.
And not that media companies have never had access to data. I mean, you guys have been data rich for years, decades. But this just propels it into a different stratosphere in terms of the real-time nature of this stuff, doesn't it? This is really the game changer that you're probably seeing.
Absolutely. I think if you think about marketing, colleagues in marketing now can respond and optimize and dial up and dial down activity in flight. So while content is airing and transmitting, for example, so the ability to kind of now react, and I think what we're learning is what we call our learning cycles are getting faster, right? So we can do something, we see the results, we're able to kind of make a change, and we can then set up a new hypothesis. The ability to kind of go around those sort of test learn cycles is now getting faster. And I think that's probably been the biggest learn for us, in that we're getting better and more forensic as an organization, because we're asking more questions of
Yeah.
data,
Yeah.
but we're also taking bigger actions off that because we have greater confidence in what we're seeing. That's been the cultural change that started to happen across those three areas.
And has that just been the driver from you and your team going out and doing this sort of AI readiness education, or have there been other sort of change management activities that you've had to embed? Because one of the things that I often find is, while data leaders are thinking about, you know, delivering products or whatever it might be, change management is very low on their list in terms of, you know, and it's not something that I say in a bad way. They probably just never come from a, you know, that sort of background, right? So it's not an easy thing to do. So what are some of the intervention strategies that you've been able to put in that have given you that breadth and, you know, just that impact within the organization?
Yeah, so for us, we baked in change and a change leader right at the start of the program.
Right.
So
Okay.
we did a lot of things with stakeholders around change readiness. So for example, when I talked about decentralizing the teams,
Yeah.
we had to assess whether the business units were ready for the team, right? We had to spend a lot of time with the team, the data individuals around business upskilling. So a lot of people talk about data upskilling and data literacy. We spent a lot of time on business literacy so that they could sort of become much more fluent with the business units they were joining.
Of course.
So change was baked in very, very early on. But I think the key thing with it is it was always a collaborative effort. So ITV is a very collegiate organization. And so, you know, because the data unit rarely owns any of the last mile levers, right? So we don't have authority or any ownership over marketing, product, or commercial. It's really critical. You need to kind of be joined at the hip with each one of those functional areas, right? So you're solving problems that are important to them, but equally that are going to help them achieve the outcomes they're trying to achieve in terms of the functional area they're sitting within. If you can align against those two things, you have a common shared set of objectives and purpose, then you're all pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
I think that's the piece that is critical in the unlock. Otherwise, I think you have a push function that's pushing ideas, and you don't have sort of the business sort of picking up and taking those and executing them in the last mile. If you don't have that last mile execution, all your investment is wasted. So we spend a lot of time talking about the last mile, activation in the last mile, readiness in the business. Is there additional capability in the last mile, like a customer data platform that's needed? Are processes needed to be changed such that the business can actually action and realize the benefits rather than doing a lot of the infrastructure and the data prepping and all the rest of it, and it never gets light of day, no value gets realized.
So, you know, it all sounds great. Right, it all sounds amazing, but what have some of the challenges been for you? Sort of, you know, I know how tough it is to do this stuff in different, you know, sectors, industries, etc. And maturity and capability often comes into the mix. You know, how fast you can run. What have been some of your challenges, and how have you overcome those? I don't know, you know, just give me a couple of challenges just so that other organizations can think about, you know, their journey as well.
So one of the things that we went went down sort of the data as a product and a data mesh kind of federated approach to this as well.
I was going to ask you about that later, but you know,
so one of the big learns is the way we originally mapped out the strategies. We thought we would go deep in one domain first, and prove ourselves. And then with that proof point, we then go to the next one, sequentially. And I think what that then meant organizationally is that if you were in a domain that was later on, you'd have to sit and wait for quite a long time before the strategy kind of got around to you. And in fact, the sort of the learn for us is, are you better off with having lots of data products in one domain, so you're super serving one particular domain, or are you better off having a few data products in lots of domains? And I think the latter is probably preferred, because what you realize, if you have a few in lots of domains, you're able to then create higher order value cases that are much more strategically important to the organization, because you can now start to join up different levers in the organization versus going deep in one. So we went let's go one and let's go deep. In hindsight, I think it would have been better to go shallow and wide versus narrow and deep.
Okay.
Yeah, that was definitely a big learn for us. I think the second is sort of, you know, underestimating or overestimating rate of change and progress, right? Because when in an organization like ITV, and I think it's true of many organizations, is you have different microcultures, right? Yes, there's an overall culture, but
there's no, yeah.
sales versus creative are very, very different, culturally. And I think within that, you're going to have different levels of digital and data expertise. So, for example, in marketing, you have digital marketeers, right? They're very, very fluent with cost per acquired user. They're very savvy. They've been optimizing for years. Similar in commercial, right? You have digital sales teams.
Yeah.
But you don't always have that in all parts of the organization. So the ability to kind of calibrate your approach rather than having a one size fits all for change is really key, right? Because you have different levels of maturity, different levels of understanding, different levels of comfort with using some of these things. So you need to kind of recalibrate based on that. There isn't like a one size fits all. And that's probably another big learn for us in terms of what we've done and how we're approaching. If we were to do it again, what we'd do differently.
Fantastic. Just, going back to your point about operating model and the way that you've sort of embedded teams, how, you talked just there about data mesh, which is very much I would say it's not a technological thing, not right now anyway. It's more of a cultural, organizational viewpoint. But when you attempted to the move to that, was it really was it a backtrack, or was it saying we need to think about our operating model differently because maybe having a truly federated model just doesn't give us the right, I don't know, controls? Or how was it, onboarded, or what was the impact of that? And then how did you pivot or change?
Yes, it's quite interesting. So ITV is very much sort of a federated organization. So what I mean by that is business units are largely empowered to sort of run as fast as they can, if that makes sense. So they tend to have, their own internal sort of IT directors, technology directors within a particular business unit.
Okay.
If you look at our labels, for example, we own something like 50 odd labels, but each one of them has autonomy to run independently, and we need that independence, if that makes sense. So because culturally that's how we operated, to then mandate a strong center where you put it all into a lake, it's all governed centrally, just wasn't going to work, right? It just culturally wouldn't have worked well. So what I think was quite elegant about Mesh, and I think I agree with you completely, it isn't a technology solution. You can't buy it, as a SaaS solution. A lot of the time was thought about the operating model, how you define a domain, what logically sits in a domain. That was probably the harder part to get right. I think once we've got that set up, I think the whole notion of embedding, you have your own team, it's part of a capacity model. Therefore, things like prioritization become a lot simpler because each business unit have to prioritize within the capacity they have, which gets really interesting then, right? So it drives the right kind of conversations in the business units, which I think is really key because then you do the right level of prioritization. I think some of the emerging challenges as we roll forward are some of the philosophical questions around, well, what happens when a data product gets too big? How do we decide whether you split it or do you leave it? Some of the products that are starting to span multiple domains, it gets really interesting around, well, who's the owner? Who funds the changes?
The age old,
and who maintains, right? Because often what you find is a producer of a data product or a producer of data and a consumer of a data product sit in two different areas. And one will gain disproportionately from the consuming of it versus the producing of it. And therefore that nuance can get quite gnarly and complex, and we haven't solved for that still. But I can see these emerging challenges as we mature and we get further along this journey.
So how do you handle that sort of, I actually I don't even know how big your team is, so I'm just wondering how you handle that complexity and such. You've got 50 labels and you've got so many different brands, and then you've got many people pushed down at those levels. Are you almost having smaller or is there a Sanjeevan for 10 of those brands, and another 10 and another 10? How are you actually working through that? You can't be everywhere at the same time.
No, absolutely. So what we have is we have sort of these working groups that bring together the sort of what we call the domain leads, if you will, effectively. to do a couple of things really. One is just to understand what are the sorts of products they're building, because often what we're observing is a product that might be needed for marketing. If we make a couple of changes, could be hugely valuable for commercial. Because effectively, marketing and commercial are sort of solving the same problem, but through the different end of a telescope, if that makes sense. You know, they're seeing the problem from a different lens. So that helps us sort of identify, okay, with a marginal sort of investment, we can service multiple stakeholders, which is a great kind of benefit. The second, I think, is it helps around knowledge sharing and standardization of what we're doing, how things are being prioritized. So that sort of working group that spans a lot of these different areas come together, and that knowledge sharing mechanism is sort of a bit of a sense check around some of the things you're describing, and that's where we capture some of those things. And what's been really interesting is the ideation that sort of bounces across. It becomes a bit of a glue that starts to bring the organization together, because you sort of get different ideas spanning the different parts of the organization that are getting sort of, you know, seeded in data potentially, but then get federated back out again, which I think starts to join up the organization and join the dots a lot more.
But interestingly, as a media organization, you can do that much better than any other organization, I'm assuming. Or is it difficult? Because, you know, you're such a creative industry, you know, and there's lots of different types of people, but ideation is the main aspect of how you drive your innovation and you know, new ideas or concepts and with data and AI as another factor in that, has it given a different nuance to the way that people ideate, or has it just largely, you know, been sort of, you know, business as usual?
No, I think the phase we're at the moment, we're still exploring and experimenting. I think is what it is, right? So what's emerged in a couple of things we've looked at is, because it isn't quite there yet, there's still some pointy edges with some of the outputs.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? There's still some things that aren't quite usable. But in some other areas, we're finding that actually it can create quite an interesting productivity gain. I think that the big sort of macro picture we're seeing certainly is in post-production, it seems to be sort of, you know, quite effective at sort of reducing the cost that, you know, a creative business like ours might incur. But in the pre-production phase, where you're at the ideation, you know, narrative arcs, those things, we're still quite early in that sort of embryonic, let's explore how might it work, how do you get utility out of this. And one thing we often debate is, you know, is it a case that we're after more ideas? And I'd argue, you know, we've probably got more content that we can consume, or is it better ideas? And that's quite a subjective assessment, right? So I think we're going through that recalibration around, okay, well, how does this productivity gain get recognized? How do we understand and put value around this sort of productivity gain? And I think we're at that phase of that sort of evolution at the moment. And so speaking to colleagues in other industries, I think there's a similar thing in the creative industries around just figuring out, how do we see the productivity benefit in this area, and the ideation and some of the creation side of things, i.e. everything in the pre-production phase.
Fantastic. I just want to switch gears for a second, because I think you're in a quite a unique position actually. You're at a group level, so you're focusing way more on strategy than a lot of other data leaders. And I know you've come from a strategic background. What advice would you give to data leaders who are possibly coming more from a technology background and now being thrust into this position where they've got to create strategies, or they've got to think strategically? What advice would you give them on a sort of, you know, top 3 things that you would think would be really good for them to latch onto and start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the big ones for me are first and foremost is invest time in horizon scanning, right? And what I mean by that is don't just look at your own sector, look at other sectors and horizon scan. So what are the emerging themes, trends, technologies that are kind of coming up in the next 18, 24? And we don't always know, but at least have a bit of a finger on the pulse of those things. Second one then for me, once you've got that, is then extract that concept and assess 2 things. Does it create a threat to your current value chain and the moat that you have and the IP that you've got and your fixed versus variable cost model? Is it a threat? Or does it create a huge amount of opportunity for you?
Right. Okay.
And just if you keep that sort of value creation versus value destruction
Yeah.
kind of mental model
Mm-hmm.
with each of the kind of these emerging trends. That helps you sort of assess that.
Mm-hmm.
The third bit then is get a read around the maturity of these things. So
Right.
how ready are they? Is it at a consumer grade level, or are
Mm-hmm.
they enterprise grade solutions?
Mm-hmm.
What are the
Mm-hmm.
adoption curves looking like, right? Is it largely
Yeah.
being consumer adopted, in which case it's more like user generated, or is it actually enterprise adoption? What does that then
Mm-hmm.
look like?
Mm-hmm.
And I think those 3 to 4 things, I think, help you sort of recalibrate what's coming up. And
Mm.
I think you need to be able to feed some of those things into your thinking in terms of the strategy you're establishing and the execution, right? Because then I think you're getting into much more of a growth mindset
Yeah.
versus a cost management mindset.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that, certainly for listed organizations, everyone wants to talk about where is growth going to come from? Where are you
Mm.
going in the story?
Mm.
What does this mean for your business model? I think that gets quite compelling because you can then you can tell a very different story around where the organization can go with some of these capabilities.
Yeah. Yeah. And how have you positioned the idea that when you start to because you talk about value creation, which is great, I mean, that's where it should be, and you talk about value driven and the value chain. How have you positioned the idea of thinking about when you're positioning a new tool, or you're coming up with a new strategy? What are what are the areas that you would lean into in terms of the sort of ROI, and just trying to sort of think about how well would this do for us? What will it actually give us? And I think that's what a lot of data leaders today struggle with. How do I prove that this thing is actually going to help us to do something and it's going to drive that growth? And coming from a very growth-led view, it would just be interesting to get your take on that.
Yeah, but I think that starts with those relationships, if I can be
Yeah.
honest. So, because the ownership of that value that you're describing and the
Mm,
realization of it
mm,
happens in the last mile.
yeah.
So it requires you as a leader to kind of, work with your CMOs, your chief marketing officers, or your chief commercial officers. And you're doing the kind of the what if conversation, right? So with
Yeah.
marketing, the conversation around, if we could build a predictive model
Mm,
that could, reduce the cost to acquire a monthly active user by 5%, what would that do to your
yes.
ability to hitting, our monthly active user target?
Yeah.
And I guarantee it, your CMO will know that answer
Yeah.
because they're
Yeah. Yeah.
constantly looking at optimizing return on marketing investment, right? Then you just need to be confident that actually you can build a
You,
model that can predict at that level of accuracy. Because if you don't get that commitment of not necessarily the number, but the commitment to execute
mm-hmm.
and run and deliver against that number,
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
of your cost is never going to
Mm-hmm.
get realized, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
because it's those business leaders that ultimately, you know, taking on those numbers and effectively, are co-committing
Mm,
those
mm,
numbers, it's
mm.
really important you've got to involve them at the outset, right? Otherwise, you're coming up with these fictitious numbers,
Oh, of
and
course.
what are you
Yeah.
doing? You're going to sort of throw it over to them to deliver? It's not going to work,
Yes.
right?
So,
So they've
so,
got to be really bought into it
yeah.
right at the outset.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think there's a delicate balance there, because I think that's the right way to go. But what tends to happen is then this whole idea of attribution. People are struggling with that now. How do I attribute what I did to what your outcome was? And I think that's from a leadership perspective, you're sitting across from the CMO, and the CMO goes, "Okay, you got me an extra 3%." Well, how do we know whether it was 3% from that predictive model you gave me, or the actions that we took? So I think there's always that as well, which becomes a moot point for people. Well, no, it can't be, because now it's my revenue number, or
Yeah, but I think on this one, I
mm,
think this gets into a philosophical question around
yeah,
how the organization does capital allocation, right?
yes,
And
yes,
and probably the conversation then with the CFO in that, look, and I think you're right. You have options around attribution or benefits
yeah,
realization, right?
yeah,
You can either like measure everything to the nth degree, in which
mm-hmm,
case you're going to
mm-hmm,
put forward a cost,
mm-hmm,
which is building an entire cottage industry
yeah,
of forensically measuring and isolating benefits. Is
mm-hmm,
that really what we
mm-hmm,
want as a business?
mm-hmm,
Or do we all agree that a light touch approach that says, look, this is what happened in one campaign. We all agree if we scale this up to 100 campaigns, you get, not quite 100x, but, you get a 70,
yeah,
60 or whatever
significant,
percentage
yeah,
lift on that.
yeah,
And I think what we did is we had that conversation around, well,
right,
how forensically do we want to be?
yeah,
Because deeply isolating it is going to cost us a lot more because we have to put
yes,
people in and
yes,
capability in. Is that really what we
mm-hmm,
want?
mm-hmm,
Or do we want a light touch? So we want to say direction of travel is
mm-hmm,
indicative that it's
mm-hmm,
moving the needle.
mm-hmm,
And I think that's a conversation I think leaders need to have because
yeah,
that
yeah,
that
agreed,
ultimately translates to additional capital you're looking to invest. just to do benefits tracking. And you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Or do we have a feeling that actually, because you're becoming more data driven, there's a halo effect of benefits and agility that are probably more some of the intangibles that actually you are going to gain from it. And actually, if you get direction of travel right with the benefits tracking, you're then getting a lot of kind of the halo benefits as well.
You are. Yeah, and I think it's about the collaboration piece you talked about earlier. If you don't have that from the beginning, then you're not going to be able to get that as you go through. So my last question to you, what are you excited about for the future in terms of not only in your industry, but for yourself,
So I think, gosh, it's really hard to read where it's going to go now. But I think the whole, seeing, organizations, companies kind of reinvent their value chain, right? Because I think that's going to become really fascinating as this play out. I think we'll see the emergence of sort of AI first or purebred kind of AI-driven organizations, right? Where they have sort of completely just rethought how every part of a business process might be AI generated and what does that look like. I think increasingly digital twins will emerge a lot more on the horizon, where organizations will kind of create a mirror and run really complex optimizations and scenarios across that to understand what lever do they really need to pull. And I think be able to kind of scenario play that, I think becomes a really powerful executive sort of set of tooling. And I think the multi-agent, I think that gets really interesting. I don't think we're there yet, but it feels like there needs to be sort of like an operating system kind of wrapper around this that enterprise can then start to use this at scale. But that gets really fascinating for, I think, data leaders in the space, because it takes us very much into that innovation and being a driver of innovation and growth compared to sort of, dashboarding and insights and some of the other things that perhaps, mark the previous era of
maybe
data leadership roles.
They might adapt and change in a very different way, which I'm hoping that will be the case as well, because I think large language models and will probably get us to a very, very different view of what those might be. Well, look, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on, Sanjeevan. It's really, really enjoyed our chat today. I mean, there's so many other things that I wanted to talk about, but we only have a finite amount of time. But thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me, Samir.
It's a pleasure. Absolutely.